Recently, a truth that has been quietly preserved for millennia in the mountain monasteries of Ethiopia finally erupted onto the internet, challenging one of the most foundational stories in the Western world. That truth was a shocking one. The name Lucifer, the name we have been taught to associate with the ultimate angelic adversary, does not, in fact, refer to a fallen angel in the original scriptures. It refers to a human king, a proud, arrogant ruler of Babylon whose story was a warning against earthly hubris, not a report on a heavenly rebellion. And after carefully examining the linguistic evidence, the historical context of Isaiah 14, and the testimony of the ancient Ethiopic tradition, we are here today to make a stunning admission. They were absolutely, unequivocally correct. The story of Lucifer as the brilliant, rebellious archangel is a masterpiece of mythology, woven together from a single Latin mistranslation, the poetic flourishes of Dante and Milton, and centuries of church tradition. But it is not the story the prophet Isaiah was telling. The exposure of this long-held misunderstanding is a vital act of theological correction, a stripping away of layers of myth to get back to the original text. It is a moment of clarity that we applaud, and if that was the end of the story, our investigation would be over. But it's not, because in exposing one lie, a new, far more dangerous silence was created. But here is where our investigation must take a sharp, uncomfortable turn. Because proving that the name Lucifer has been misapplied is not the same as proving that the event of an angelic fall never happened. In fact, by focusing so intensely on that single word in Isaiah, the recent expose created a gaping hole in the very fabric of the sacred narrative. It has left us with an even more unsettling question. If the story of a cosmic rebellion didn't come from that verse, then where did it come from? Is the entire concept of a war in heaven, of angels who sinned and were cast down, just a medieval fantasy? Was it all just a poetic invention to scare the faithful into submission? If you accept the conclusion that Lucifer the angel was a mistranslation, you are left with a universe where the only source of true primordial evil is the heart of man. It's a neat, tidy, and psychologically modern explanation. And it is completely, utterly wrong. The previous investigation, in its zeal to debunk a myth, created a new, more subtle one. The myth that the heavens have always been a place of perfect, unbroken peace. They surgically removed a single, mislabeled character from the stage, but in doing so, they have encouraged us to ignore the vast, bloody, and well-documented drama that was already unfolding long before the curtain ever rose on humanity. They have, in essence, told us that the king who sat on the throne was an imposter, without ever telling us who the real king was. And worse, they ignored the army of traitors that was gathering just outside the castle walls. And here is the most profound irony of all. The key to filling this new silence, the evidence that exposes the true story of the heavenly fall, comes from the exact same source the previous investigation used to build its case: Ethiopia. It is true that the ancient Ethiopian church, in its wisdom, preserved the original context of Isaiah 14, never mistaking the king of Babylon for a fallen angel. But that is only a tiny fraction of the truth they guarded. What the other video failed to mention, or perhaps did not know, is that while the Ethiopian canon preserved that one crucial detail, it also preserved a library of other forbidden scriptures that describe the actual angelic rebellion in terrifying, meticulous detail. They are the guardians not of one truth, but of many. And their most treasured, most foundational extra-biblical text is a book so ancient, so explosive, it is quoted by the apostles in the New Testament itself. A book that the Western Church fought for centuries to suppress and erase. It is called the Book of Enoch. While the rest of the world was debating the identity of a misnamed king in Babylon, the Ethiopian scribes were carefully copying and recopying the eyewitness account of the man who, according to Scripture, walked with God and was no more. Enoch was not a prophet who spoke about the future. He was a celestial journalist who was taken on a guided tour of the heavens and was shown the past, present, and future of the cosmic war. And his report, preserved faithfully in Ethiopia, does not just describe a fallen angel. It describes a fallen army. It names their leaders, lists their crimes, and records their sentence. Ethiopia didn't just debunk the story of Lucifer. It preserved the far more detailed and disturbing story that the Lucifer myth was created to replace. So this is the forbidden truth we will be investigating today. A truth far more complex and consequential than a simple mistranslation. Sacred history has not recorded one great fall. It has recorded two. And for 2,000 years, Western tradition has tragically and perhaps deliberately conflated them into a single, simplified, and ultimately misleading story. The first fall was a political one. It was the fall of a human king, the ruler of Babylon, whose earthly arrogance was so great that the prophet Isaiah mocked him with the celestial title, Son of the Dawn. This is the event that the Western Church mislabeled as the fall of Lucifer. It is a story about the limits of human power. But the second fall was a cosmic one. It was a rebellion far older, far deeper, and with far more devastating consequences. It was the fall of a class of celestial beings, a legion of angels who betrayed their sacred trust and waged a silent war against creation itself. This is the story that the Book of Enoch chronicles in chilling detail. It is a story about the origin of supernatural evil. History's great mistake was to take the name from the first story and apply it to the events of the second. In that fusion, both truths were obscured. The specific political warning of Isaiah was lost in a supernatural myth, and the terrifying, detailed account of the angelic rebellion was condensed and neutered, reduced to a vague backstory for a single theatrical villain named Lucifer. And in that confusion, the true identity and the true nature of the enemy was masterfully concealed. Our task today is to undo that confusion. It is time to separate the two crime scenes, to identify the two culprits, and to finally read the case file that has been gathering dust for millennia. Before we can understand the crime, we must first meet the witness. Who was Enoch? To the modern world, his name is a whisper, a footnote. But in the ancient world, he was a figure of immense and unparalleled importance. The book of Genesis gives us only a tantalizingly brief summary. Enoch was the seventh patriarch from Adam. In a world where men lived for centuries, he lived for 365 years. But his legacy was not his lifespan, it was his departure. The text says simply that he walked faithfully with God, then he was no more because God took him away. He is one of only 2 individuals in the entire Old Testament who did not experience death. He was taken. But where did he go, and what did he see? The Book of Enoch, the text preserved in Ethiopia, answers that question. It is not a story about Enoch. It purports to be the story told by Enoch. It is his personal testimony, his field report from a journey no other mortal had ever taken. It describes how angels descended and escorted him on a grand tour of the created universe. He was taken through the 7 heavens, shown the storehouses of the snow and the hail, the workings of the sun and the moon. He was shown the future of the world, the coming judgment, and the throne room of God himself. But most critically, he was shown the past. He was given a guided tour of a celestial crime scene. He was shown the full, unredacted history of the angelic rebellion that had so scarred the early world, and he was commanded to write it all down as a testimony, a warning for all future generations. This is why the Book of Enoch was so revered. It wasn't seen as a work of human imagination. It was considered a direct revelation, a piece of heaven's own archive, delivered to humanity by a man who had seen it with his own eyes. This is why it is quoted as authoritative by the New Testament author of Jude, and it is why its testimony on the fall of the angels must be taken with the utmost seriousness. So what was the story that Enoch was commanded to record? It begins not with pride or a desire to usurp God's throne, but with a mission. The Book of Enoch tells us that in the early days of humanity, a special class of 200 high-ranking angels were dispatched from the highest heavens and sent to the earth. Their given name was the Watchers, or those who are awake. Their task was a noble one. They were to be the first teachers of mankind, celestial guardians sent to watch over the fledgling human race, to instruct them in the ways of righteousness, and to ensure the orderly development of civilization. They were not invaders, they were emissaries. They were the original bridge between the heavenly realm and the earthly one, beings of immense wisdom and power, tasked with nurturing God's newest creation. Imagine the awe of early humanity living in the presence of these magnificent beings. It must have been a golden age, a time when the veil between worlds was thin and divine wisdom was shared freely. These were not the cloistered angels of medieval art, strumming harps on clouds. These were active governors, teachers of astronomy, agriculture, and justice. They were the guarantors of the divine order on earth. They were God's chosen regents, and their authority was absolute. The world was in their hands, and for a time that world was at peace, held in a delicate balance between the authority of heaven and the innocence of a young humanity. But it was a balance that was about to be catastrophically and irreversibly broken. But authority, especially authority exercised in close proximity to a world of flesh and blood, carries with it a profound and subtle temptation. The Watchers were celestial beings, spirits of light and fire, but they were not mindless automatons. They possessed free will, and as they watched over the generations of humanity, their guardianship began to curdle into a darker, more possessive emotion. The Book of Enoch records the catastrophic turning point with chilling clarity. It states that the Watchers, led by their chief, a high-ranking angel named Semjaza, began to look upon the daughters of men and were consumed by their beauty. This was not a fleeting, momentary temptation. It was a calculated philosophical crisis that spread through their ranks. They saw in humanity a vibrancy, a capacity for procreation and physical experience that they, as spirits, did not possess. An alien desire began to grow where only a holy duty had been. They began to see humanity not as a sacred trust to be protected, but as an opportunity to be exploited. They wanted to experience creation not as its guardians, but as its participants. They wanted to cross the ultimate boundary. The text describes a pivotal, tragic moment of conspiracy. Semjaza, their leader, knew the gravity of the sin they were contemplating. He knew it would bring a great judgment, and he feared he would be the only one to bear the punishment for so great a crime. And so, he gathered the other 19 chiefs of the Watchers on the summit of Mount Hermon, a place whose very name means a curse, and there he made them swear a binding oath, a pact of mutual imprecation. They swore together that they would all participate in the transgression, and that they would all jointly accept the curse that would inevitably follow. This was not a fall. A fall is an accident. This was a deliberate, organized, and conscious act of mutiny. It was the moment a legion of heaven's trusted guardians chose to forsake their first estate, abandon their posts, and go to war with the very order they were sworn to protect. They were about to commit an act of cosmic miscegenation, a forbidden fusion of spirit and flesh that would unleash a horror upon the earth and stain the human story forever. The oath was sworn, the line was crossed, and heaven itself held its breath. The oath sworn on Mount Hermon was the trigger, but the transgression that followed was far more strategic and sinister than a simple act of lust. The corruption of the human bloodline was only the first phase of their rebellion. The second, and arguably more devastating phase, was a deliberate act of intellectual and technological contamination. The Watchers didn't just want to participate in the human experience. They wanted to reshape it in their own image, to accelerate humanity's development along a dark and forbidden path. They began to systematically teach humanity knowledge that they were neither prepared for nor spiritually mature enough to handle. Each of the 20 chiefs of the Watchers opened a different, unholy school of thought. Azazel, one of the most prominent leaders, taught humanity the art of metallurgy, not for crafting farming tools, but for forging swords, knives, and shields. He taught them how to make bracelets and ornaments, not for beauty, but to fuel vanity and seduction. In a single generation, Azazel armed human envy and amplified human lust. He took a young race and gave them the tools for warfare and the motives for jealousy. Another, named Penamu, taught the art of writing, but with a wicked twist. He revealed to humanity the bitter and the sweet, how to write lies as if they were truth, how to craft deception, how to sow discord with ink on parchment. Semjaza, their leader, taught the arts of root-cutting and enchantments, the foundations of sorcery. Others taught astrology, the observation of the stars, not for calendrical knowledge, but for divination and the worship of the celestial bodies. This was a calculated release of classified information. It was technological and spiritual warfare waged against a primitive and unsuspecting population. Imagine giving the blueprints for a nuclear reactor to a civilization that has only just discovered fire. The knowledge itself may be neutral, but its premature release into a system that cannot handle it is an act of pure destruction. The Watchers knew this. They were deliberately short-circuiting humanity's natural development, twisting our potential for creativity and knowledge into a fast track towards self-destruction. They were not just breeding monsters of the flesh, they were breeding monsters of the mind and arming them with heaven's own forbidden secrets. The twin corruptions of blood and knowledge produced a horrific and inevitable result. The forbidden union between the celestial watchers and mortal women gave birth to a new monstrous lineage. The Book of Enoch, like Genesis 6, calls them the Nephilim. But where Genesis is brief, Enoch is terrifyingly specific. These were not merely tall men. They were biological abominations, hybrid beings whose very existence was a violation of the created order. Enoch describes them as giants who grew to consume all the acquisitions of men. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned upon them and began to devour mankind itself. They consumed the flesh of men, they drank the blood, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. Let the horror of that description settle in. This is not the language of myth, it is the language of a planetary ecological crisis. The Nephilim were a rampant, invasive species with a supernatural metabolism and no natural predators. They were consuming the world. Their violence and insatiable hunger created a cascade of chaos that tore apart the very fabric of life on Earth. The world was not just filled with violence in a moral sense, it was being physically, literally devoured. This was the ultimate consequence of the Watchers' sin. They had not just created a new race, they had unleashed a plague. The Nephilim were a biological dead end, a sterile and monstrous parody of God's creation, and their existence was pushing the entire planet towards extinction. They were the physical embodiment of the chaos that results when the sacred boundaries between heaven and earth are violated. The world before the flood was not a simple place of human wickedness. It was a failed state. It was a world under the brutal occupation of a race of demigods. A world where humanity was no longer at the top of the food chain. It was a world teetering on the brink of total annihilation, not by a divine flood, but by the ravenous hunger of its own monstrous offspring. The cries of humanity under this brutal regime, Enoch tells us, were rising, and the heavens were about to take notice. The time for instruction was over. The time for judgment was at hand. As the chaos on earth reached a fever pitch, a report was being filed in the high courts of heaven. The Book of Enoch shifts its perspective from the blood-soaked earth to the pristine throne room of God, and it is here that the official indictment is read. The text describes the four great archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, looking down from the celestial sanctuary and witnessing the rampant destruction. They saw the blood that was being shed, the lawlessness that was being wrought, and they heard the souls of men crying out, "Bring our cause before the Most High." This is a crucial theological detail. The intervention of heaven was not an arbitrary act of a distant, angry God. It was a direct response to the suffering of humanity. It was the answer to a desperate prayer. The archangels acted as divine prosecutors, carrying the case file of a ravaged humanity and presenting it before the throne of the Ancient of Days. Their testimony is recorded in the text. They reported on the forbidden knowledge that Azazel had taught, which had filled the earth with violence and unrighteousness. They reported on the forbidden unions that Semjaza and his followers had committed, defiling themselves with human women and creating a monstrous progeny. They declared that the whole earth had been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel, and they concluded their indictment with a powerful plea for justice. To him ascribe all sin. The response from the throne was swift, final, and multifaceted. The Most High issued a series of decrees, each one assigned to a specific archangel. Uriel was sent to Noah, the son of Lamech, to warn him of the coming deluge and to instruct him on how to escape so that his seed might be preserved for all generations. Raphael was commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot, to cast him into the darkness, and to heal the earth which the angels had corrupted. Gabriel was tasked with a grim mission to destroy the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim, from among men by inciting them to a war of mutual annihilation against one another. And Michael, the commander of the heavenly host, was given the final sentence for Semjaza and all his companions. The judgment of heaven was about to fall, not just on humanity, but on its celestial corruptors as well. While the decrees against the Nephilim and the preparations for the flood were set in motion, a separate and uniquely terrifying judgment was being prepared for the architects of the calamity, the 200 Watchers themselves. Their sentence was not death, for as immortal beings they could not be killed. Theirs was a fate arguably worse than annihilation. It was a sentence of eternal, conscious imprisonment. The archangel Michael was commanded to go to Semjaza and his co-conspirators who had defiled themselves with women and to bind them. But these were not chains of iron or steel. The text describes a binding that was both temporal and spatial. They were to be bound for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth until the day of their great judgment. They were to be sealed away, alive and conscious, buried deep within the planet itself, forced to witness the destruction of their beloved monstrous children in the flood, and then to endure millennia of solitary confinement in total darkness. This is the origin of the stories of imprisoned spirits, of titans chained in Tartarus. It is the original, detailed account of the event that the Apostle Peter would later reference in his epistle when he wrote that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. The Book of Enoch provides the full, terrifying backstory to that single verse. This was not a metaphorical fall. It was a literal incarceration. The leaders of the rebellion were taken out of commission, removed from the chessboard of history, and locked away in a subterranean prison. But what of their spirits after their giant offspring, the Nephilim, were destroyed? The text adds another chilling layer. The Lord declares that the spirits of the Nephilim, proceeding from their hybrid bodies, would not be imprisoned with their fathers. They would be allowed to remain on the earth, disembodied and hungry. They would become a new class of being. Evil spirits, or demons. They would afflict, oppress, attack, and destroy, remaining on the earth as a perpetual source of corruption until the final judgment. The rebellion of the Watchers was over, but their poisonous legacy would continue to haunt humanity in a new, more insidious form. The age of the giants was ending. The age of demons was about to begin. So now we have the complete, unredacted account as preserved in the Book of Enoch and remembered by the Ethiopian Church. It is a story of a celestial mission, a conspiratorial betrayal, a dual corruption of blood and knowledge, a monstrous progeny, and a multi-layered judgment that involved a global flood, a war of giants, the binding of fallen angels deep within the earth, and the unleashing of a new plague of disembodied spirits upon the world. It is a story of breathtaking cosmic scope, and it is precisely this scope, this complexity, that made it so dangerous to the gatekeepers of Western tradition. Why would they choose to sideline this detailed apostolic quoted narrative and instead elevate a single misunderstood verse about a Babylonian king into the definitive story of the ultimate evil. The answer lies in the human desire for simplicity and control. The story of the Watchers is profoundly messy. It complicates everything. First, as we've discussed, it demolishes the neat idea that sin originates solely with humanity. It presents a universe where heaven itself is capable of mutiny. A truth that is deeply unsettling to any theology that demands a perfect, incorruptible celestial realm. It is easier to believe in one bad apple than an entire orchard that has been compromised. Second, it presents an enemy that is not a single monolithic entity. The opposition is not just the devil. It is a complex hierarchy of beings with different origins and different roles, the imprisoned Watchers themselves, their disembodied demonic offspring roaming the earth, and as we will see, a third, even more mysterious figure who acts as their leader. This is not a simple duel between a hero and a villain. This is a multi-front war. For theologians trying to build a simple, easy-to-understand catechism for the masses, this level of complexity was a nightmare. It was far more effective to consolidate all these threats into a single, cartoonish figure with a pitchfork and a memorable, misapplied name: Lucifer. Finally, the Watcher narrative presents a form of divine justice that is terrifyingly physical. Angels being chained in the valleys of the earth, a flood as a genetic cleansing. This is not the abstract philosophical justice of the Greek thinkers. This is the raw, elemental justice of a creator intervening directly and violently in his creation. It is a story that emphasizes God's power over his more palatable attributes of mercy and love. The Western Church Fathers, especially as they sought to appeal to a sophisticated Greco-Roman world, would have found this kind of primordial justice embarrassing. It was easier to spiritualize the fall, to turn it into a poetic tragedy about pride, than to confront the gritty, physical and brutal details of the account preserved in Enoch. The story had to be tamed, and the best way to tame it was to replace it. So, where does this leave us? We are now standing in the middle of a celestial crime scene with two seemingly separate case files. In one hand, we have the file on Lucifer, the king of Babylon, a story of human hubris, of a man who reached for the heavens and was struck down. It is a political story, a historical warning, a fall from a throne. In the other hand, we have the far more detailed file on Semjaza and the Watchers, a story of angelic corruption, of celestial beings who descended to the earth and defiled it. It is a cosmic story, a primordial tragedy, a fall from grace. For centuries, Western tradition has mistakenly taken the name from the first file and slapped it on the cover of the second, creating a single, confusing, and ultimately inaccurate narrative. The recent expose that Lucifer was never an angel correctly identified this administrative error. It proved that the name and the event didn't match. But its fatal mistake was in concluding that because the name was wrong, the second case file, the entire story of the angelic fall, must be empty, a fiction. The real truth, the forbidden truth, preserved in the full library of the Ethiopic scriptures, is that both case files are real, both stories are true, and they are not contradictory. They are two sides of the same counterfeit coin. They are two distinct patterns of rebellion against the divine order, two different strategies employed by the same enemy. Think of it this way. The first pattern, the Lucifer pattern, is the rebellion of ascent. It is the temptation for the lower to illegitimately seize the position of the higher. It is the pride of a mortal man declaring himself to be a god. It is the sin of Babel, of Pharaoh, of Nebuchadnezzar. The second pattern, the watcher pattern, is the rebellion of dissent. It is the temptation for the higher to illegitimately abdicate its position and descend into the corruption of the lower. It is the sin of a celestial guardian abandoning his holy post to indulge in earthly flesh. It is a story of dereliction of duty, a corruption of a sacred trust. These are not the same story. They are the two primary fronts in the cosmic war, the assault from below and the treason from within. And by understanding both, we can finally begin to unmask the true singular intelligence that orchestrates both campaigns. If the Lucifer pattern of human hubris is real, and the watcher pattern of angelic corruption is also real, then a critical question emerges. Are these just two independent, spontaneous rebellions? Or is there a singular, unifying intelligence behind them both? Is there a grand strategist, a hidden hand moving the pieces on the board? This is where the Western world's obsession with the name Lucifer has done the most damage. By conflating everything into one simplified villain, it has blinded us to the true command structure of the opposition. To find the identity of the true mastermind, we must once again turn to the witness that has been silenced in the West but preserved in Ethiopia, the Book of Jubilees. As we've established in previous investigations, Jubilees provides a detailed angelic commentary on the events of Genesis, and in its account of the aftermath of the flood, it introduces a third crucial character into our drama. The story goes like this. After the flood, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the demons, began to torment Noah's grandchildren. Noah prayed to God for relief, and God commanded his angels to bind them all. But at that moment, another figure steps out of the shadows. The text calls him the chief of the spirits, the prince Mastema. The name Mastema in Hebrew means hatred, hostility, or enmity. He is the embodiment of accusation and opposition, and he makes a chilling appeal to God. He argues that if all the demonic spirits are bound, his entire purpose will be nullified. He petitions the throne of God to allow him to keep 1/10 of his demonic forces on the earth to continue his work of tempting, misleading, and accusing mankind until the final judgment. In a mysterious act of divine sovereignty, his request is granted. This is the figure the New Testament would later call Satan, the accuser. He is not the king of Babylon. And, crucially, he is not one of the imprisoned watchers. He is their commander. He is a third, distinct and higher-ranking entity. He is the intelligence that orchestrates the chaos. He is the one who whispers the temptation of the Lucifer pattern into the ears of kings, encouraging them to ascend. And he is the one who masterminded the watcher pattern, encouraging the angels to descend. He is the true adversary, a being who was not content with his own fall and has been working tirelessly ever since to ensure that all of creation, both human and angelic, falls with him. So what is the legacy of this great confusion? What happens when a civilization spends 2,000 years conflating a human king, a legion of fallen angels, and their supreme commander into a single mythological figure named Lucifer? The consequences are not merely academic. They are profoundly practical, and they have left us spiritually disarmed. By obsessing over a single mislabeled name, we have made ourselves blind to the true, multifaceted nature of the war we are in. The first consequence is that we have been conditioned to look for the wrong enemy in the wrong place. The popular image of Lucifer, the singular, supremely powerful, rebellious archangel, creates a kind of theological paralysis. It presents an adversary so cosmically powerful that the average person feels utterly helpless against him. But the true story, as revealed in the separated accounts, presents a far more complex and accessible battlefield. The enemy is not one being, it is a system. It is a hierarchy, and its primary modes of attack are not grand, celestial battles, but the recognizable patterns of human pride and spiritual corruption. The confusion has made us stare at a caricature of a dragon in the sky, while ignoring the very real snakes in the grass at our feet. The second consequence is that we have lost the ability to properly diagnose the different forms that evil takes. When everything is attributed to a single devil, we fail to distinguish between different types of spiritual threats. Is the problem we are facing one of human arrogance and the lust for power, the Lucifer pattern? If so, the solution involves humility, accountability, and the challenging of unjust authority. Or is the problem we are facing one of spiritual decay, forbidden knowledge, and demonic influence, the Watcher pattern? If so, the solution involves spiritual discernment, prayer, and the casting out of unclean spirits. By using a single catch-all name for the enemy, we have forgotten that different diseases require different cures. We have been trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The great confusion, then, has been the enemy's greatest strategic victory. It has kept us fighting a ghost, while the real armies advance on two separate fronts. It has given us a single, simple story of evil that is emotionally satisfying but practically useless. It has left us as a people who are experts on a mythological villain, but amateurs in the real, gritty, and complex war for the human soul. To arm ourselves against this confusion, we need a new model. We need to discard the single theatrical image of Lucifer and replace it with the strategic reality of a two-front war. The adversary we face is not a singular being with a singular method. It is a two-faced enemy, employing two distinct but coordinated strategies of attack, both orchestrated by the same hidden intelligence, Prince Mastema, the accuser. The first face of the enemy is the one that looks upward. This is the face of the Lucifer pattern. Its primary weapon is pride. Its core temptation, whispered since the Garden of Eden, is, "You shall be as gods." It targets our ambition, our intellect, our desire for power, significance, and control. It encourages humanity to ascend, to climb out of its designated place, to build its own towers of Babel, whether they are made of brick and mortar or silicon and code. It persuades kings, CEOs, scientists, and even theologians that they can, through their own brilliance, perfect the world and become the masters of their own destiny. This face of the enemy doesn't tempt us with base, carnal pleasures. It tempts us with the clean, well-lit and carpeted offices of righteous-sounding power. It is the temptation to become more than human. The second face of the enemy is the one that looks downward. This is the face of the Watcher pattern. Its primary weapon is corruption. Its core temptation is not to ascend, but to descend. Not to become a god, but to become less than human, to become a beast. It targets our appetites, our flesh, our desires for sensation without consequence. It encourages a surrender to the primal, the chaotic, the sensual. It promotes the dissolution of boundaries, the blurring of lines between the sacred and the profane, the holy and the animalistic. This is the force that drives addiction, that fuels senseless violence, that champions a philosophy of, if it feels good, do it. It doesn't promise to make you a god. It promises to free you from the burdens of being human, to let you revel in the mud. For millennia, we have been attacked from both directions. The accuser tempts the powerful to ascend into tyranny, and he tempts the masses to descend into decadence. And the perfect, diabolical state is achieved when a society is led by arrogant Lucifers and populated by debased, distracted Nephilim. Recognizing these two distinct faces, these two separate strategies, is the first and most critical step in learning how to fight back. So what does this mean for us personally? How does understanding this two-front war change the way we live? It means that the concept of spiritual warfare is far more nuanced and intimate than we have been led to believe. It is not a distant battle fought by angels in the clouds, nor is it a simple matter of resisting the devil. It is the daily, conscious struggle to maintain our God-given position as human beings against the twin forces that seek to destroy it. The true battle is fought on a razor's edge. Our sacred duty is to stand in the middle, in the place where God created us to be, as creatures made in His image, a little lower than the angels, but crowned with glory and honor. And from this central position, we are assaulted from both sides. The war against the Lucifer pattern is the war for humility. It is the fight against our own internal Pharaoh, the voice that tells us we are self-sufficient, that we are the captains of our own souls, that we don't need God. It is the intellectual struggle to submit our reason to divine revelation, to serve rather than to rule, to recognize that true greatness is found not in exalting ourselves, but in humbling ourselves. This is the war fought in our ambitions, in our careers, in our pursuit of knowledge and power. At the same time, the war against the Watcher pattern is the war for holiness. It is the fight against our own internal beast, the voice that tells us our bodies are meaningless, that our appetites are king, that there are no sacred boundaries. It is the visceral struggle to honor the sanctity of the body, to control our passions rather than be controlled by them, to flee from the spiritual corruption that masquerades as freedom. This is the war fought in our entertainment, in our relationships, in our secret desires. We are, in essence, guardians of a sacred central territory called humanity, and the enemy, the accuser, is constantly trying to lure us off that holy ground, either by tempting us to climb a fraudulent ladder to godhood, or by enticing us to slide down a slippery slope into animalism. To stand firm is to resist both temptations simultaneously. It is to be fully, gloriously, and humbly human, just as we were created to be. Once you begin to see this two-front war within yourself, you cannot help but see it playing out on the grand stage of society. The question posed by the other video, "Who is Lucifer today?" was a brilliant one, but it was incomplete. Armed with our unsealed case files, we can now ask the right questions, the full questions. The first question is indeed, where do we see the Lucifer pattern at work? Where do we see the relentless temptation to ascend into godhood? Look at the halls of power in government, in finance, in technology. Look for the leaders who speak of remaking humanity in their own image, who believe that with enough data, enough money, or enough control, they can solve the problems of death, disease, and even human nature itself. Look for the systems that demand total allegiance, that place the state or the corporation above God, that punish dissent as blasphemy. This is the clean, well-lit, and often celebrated face of modern pride. It is the sophisticated intellectual rebellion that promises utopia but builds a digital Tower of Babel. But we must also ask the second, equally important question. Where do we see the watcher pattern at work? Where do we see the relentless temptation to descend into chaos? Look at the currents of culture, in entertainment, in media, in the dissolution of traditional values. Look for the forces that celebrate degradation as freedom, that champion appetite over self-control, that erase the sacred boundaries between human and animal, male and female, holy and profane. Look for the systems that profit from addiction, that market decadence, and that tell a generation that the only truth is their own fleeting desires. This is the gritty, visceral, and often celebrated face of modern corruption. It is the rebellion that doesn't seek to build a tower, but to tear everything down into a primal, hedonistic mire. The true genius of the accuser's strategy is that these two forces, while seeming like opposites, work together perfectly. The Luciferian elite, obsessed with control and order, can only justify their ever-expanding power by pointing to the ever-increasing chaos of the watcher-infected culture below. And the debased culture, stripped of its moral compass, is too distracted and too decadent to resist the creeping tyranny from above. It is a perfect feedback loop of evil, and we are living right in the middle of it. So now, let us return to the question that started this entire investigation, the name Lucifer. The Ethiopian scriptures were correct to preserve the truth that the Lucifer of Isaiah 14 was a human king, not a fallen angel. The recent expose was correct to bring that truth to the world's attention. But the full testimony of those same Ethiopic scriptures, the testimony of Enoch and Jubilees, reveals the final missing piece of the puzzle. The story of the king of Babylon was included in Scripture by the Holy Spirit for a reason. It was not the original story of the fall, but it was a perfect earthly echo of it. The king's pride, his desire to ascend to heaven and make himself like the Most High, was a perfect mirror image of the original celestial pride that sparked the first rebellion. And the name the Western world mistakenly assigned to him, Lucifer, the light-bearer, while historically inaccurate for that specific king, is, by a stroke of profound, almost divine irony, the perfect job description for the true adversary, the accuser, Satan. What does the great deceiver do? He presents himself as an angel of light. He bears a false light. He offers a counterfeit illumination, the forbidden knowledge of the watchers, the promise of godhood to humanity. He is, in function if not in name, the ultimate false light-bearer. Therefore, the great confusion over the name Lucifer was not just a mistake, it was a distraction. It was a smokescreen. By getting us to argue for centuries over the identity of a single mislabeled character, the true enemy has been able to operate freely in the shadows, deploying his two primary strategies without being properly identified. We have been arguing over the name of a puppet while the puppet master pulls the strings. It is time to end the argument. It is time to stop obsessing over a single name and start recognizing the patterns of the enemy's behavior. The Ethiopic scriptures, when read in their totality, give us the complete intelligence briefing. They debunk the myth of Lucifer the fallen angel, but in its place they give us something far more valuable, a detailed, accurate and actionable field guide to the real cosmic war. So, the other video was right. Lucifer wasn't the angel who fell, but in their rush to close one case file, they failed to open the far more important one right next to it. They exposed a lie, but in the process, they inadvertently created a new, more dangerous silence around the truth of the real angelic rebellion. We are here to fill that silence. We are here to present the full testimony. The gatekeepers of the West chose to simplify the story, to give you a single, theatrical villain. We choose to give you the unredacted intelligence briefing because we believe you are not an audience to be entertained, but a jury that deserves to hear all the evidence. The real war is not against a single, misnamed figure. It is a war on two fronts. A war against the pride that tempts us to ascend into gods, and a war against the corruption that tempts us to descend into beasts. It is a war orchestrated by a hidden mastermind, the accuser, who delights in our confusion. Welcome to the real battle. Welcome to the uncensored truth. The case file on the King of Babylon is now closed. The case file on the Watchers is now open, and our investigation has only just begun.